Welcome back to Train Signal Citrix XenApp training. You're watching Advanced Farm Administration Part 2. Alright, so in this lesson, we are going to take a look at more advanced farm administration and user administration tasks. So we're going to start by, well, how do you manage user sessions? Now that we've connected you, we've configured the environment, we have all our XenApp servers, everything's up and running, users are starting to connect. Well, what are my options? How do I communicate? How do I interact with that particular user? How do I shadow the user? How do I log them off? How do I disconnect them? How do I talk to the user, right? So we're going to cover that in managing the user session. I'm going to show you how to do that. We're going to talk about the shadow taskbar. The shadow taskbar is a tool that's available to you that I would recommend you publish to power users. What shadow taskbar allows you to do is if you publish that to your power users, then these power users can shadow their colleagues. So again, if you have applications that maybe the help desk isn't equipped, doesn't have the knowledge to troubleshoot, but you have power users within the user community that can help their colleagues, these users would be designated with the shadow taskbar, so they have that application. Users can call into power users and they can shadow them, help them through a particular issue, a particular problem, and then when they're done, they get on with their way. Think of this as like a go to my PC, except it's within the enterprise and it's very specific to XenApp. So it's a very, very helpful tool. We're going to talk about the ICA listener configuration. Now, we've talked about in earlier lessons how every one of the XenApp servers has ICA listener ports. The listener port's job is to accept an incoming session, make the connection between the session and the server, and it goes back into a listening state. Well, I'm going to show you where you can go to configure the ICA listener so that if it's having an issue, you can take a look at it and add a new listener, delete it, disable it, whatever you need to do. And finally, in this lesson, we're going to take a look at Speed Screen Latency Reduction Manager. Speed Screen Latency Reduction Manager is a tool that allows you to configure applications to take advantage of extreme latency links. So if you have links that are 500 milliseconds or above, where if you're typing, the text isn't immediately showing up on the screen, or if you're double clicking a mouse for a particular icon, it's not immediately registering. There are certain things that you can do with Speed Screen Latency Reduction Manager that would enhance the user experience and the user performance of that session by reducing the font size, for example, changing the font color down to the default, acknowledging that double click by maybe not allowing you to double click again. So a number of things that would help the administrator and the user configure stuff so that the user knows, all right, I understand that the server knows I'm typing or I'm double clicking the mouse. I can keep going, and it's just gonna, as soon as the session catches up to me, it's going to acknowledge my clicks and my mouse movements, etc. So it's just a way of easing or making the user experience better for those high latency connections that are coming into your XenApp farm. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we can take advantage of all these tools. So we're back on our XenApp server here, XA01, and now that we have the environment configured and users are starting to connect to the environment, let's take a look at how you can manage the users that are connecting into your XenApp servers in the farm, how you can interact with them, how you can help them if need be. Now, depending on how large your XenApp farm is going to be, you might like one method or another by which you enumerate the different users that are connected to your farm. Some users or some administrators like to enumerate the users that are connected based on the application. Others like to look at it based on the server, etc. Now, if you get a call from a user, again, you can ask the user, hey, which application are you connected to? And the user's like, well, I'm currently connected to WinRAR. So you can select WinRAR here. And from the tabs that you see up here, you can select on connected users. Connected users will list all of the users in your farm that are using the WinRAR application. So this gives you an easier method by which you can sort these users out. Now keep in mind, I'm showing you these different methods by which you can find the user, because assuming that you're deploying Citrix or XenApp in particular for a large number of users, this could very easily be 500 or 600 users here. This might be an easier way of finding the user because you're narrowing it down to a particular application, and then you can just sort the users out by alphabetically. So you can see here that I have the user administrator that is connecting via ICA, so they're connecting to a published application, which is WinRAR. Their session ID is 2. It's an active session, so they're not idle or anything like that. The type of protocol is ICA that they're connecting from. You'll notice here that the client name that they're connecting from is Encom Client 01. When did they log on? Which server are they connected to? So if you can find a pattern between the servers, if you're troubleshooting that, I have 5 calls and they're all on XA01, then maybe I should take a look at the XA01 server. Now, if you wanted to interact with that particular user, you can always select the session. You'll have information about that session down here. You have different tabs by which you can toggle through, and I'll go through each of them to get more information about the user. But first of all, if you wanted to interact with this particular session, you can reset the session, which means the user is just going to immediately lose access to the session. This is handy. Sometimes, the user's lost connection. They're calling, say, hey, I don't have a connection, but you're looking at it and everything is good. You just want to release it, delete it from the server, get rid of it. Reset just lets it go right away. Log off is different than reset in that it doesn't just drop the session and just doesn't care. It's like yanking the power cord out of the wall. It just shuts down the box. Log off, what log off does is it will gracefully shut it down. So if there's anything that needs to be saved, it'll give it a little bit of time to save, initiate a reset command lightly so that the user doesn't immediately get cut off right away. Disconnect will put the session in disconnect mode. So if you're noticing that the user is idle for 2 hours or so, but you don't necessarily want to log them off or reset their session because, I don't know, it's the CFO and you're not really sure, you can at least put them in disconnect mode where the session is still active. It's just not consuming as much resources as if the user was logged on or doing something, or if it was idle for that matter. If you are trying to evacuate users from a server because you want to take that server and put it in maintenance mode, you can select one or more users, right click, and then click send message, and you can type in whatever message you want. Once you type in this is a test, for example, and you click on OK, that message will immediately be delivered to the user. So let me switch to the client here so you can see what happened. And voila, you immediately got the message that I sent. This is a test. This could have been, hey, please log off and log back in 5 minutes, or log off, we are doing some maintenance on this particular server, log back in around 1 o'clock or something like that. The user can acknowledge it. Obviously, you'll have to send it more than once in order for the users to pay attention to what you're saying. Let's go back to XA01 here. Now, these are some of the tools by which you can interact with the user. Now, a very popular one would be if you right-click here and come down to shadow, you can shadow this particular user, so it's like a remote control, like a VNC. We've seen this 100 times, where you're able to look at what the user's currently doing and interact with that session, like a GoToMeeting or even a GoToMyPC, where you're able to help the user with a particular thing, and then you can log out and have them continue on with the rest of their day. If you click down here to other tasks, basically refresh user data, this is not very dynamic information. So if this session or state is active right now and you wanted to see if it became idle at any point, you can specify all the thresholds, etc., and then click it again, and it'll update or refresh the users that are currently connected with the most up-to-date data here. Now, there's other things that you can do with this particular user, and you can do them by double-clicking on that user or by looking at the tabs down here, and I'll show you in a second when we double-click it what happens. But if you go to the, if you look at it down here, you can see that it's just basic information about this particular session, what the username, the session ID, the application, the protocol, whether it's active or not, the name of the machine that they're connecting from, when they were connected, how long they've been idle, the server they're connecting to, the farm, etc., etc. So just a lot of information about the particular user that's currently connected. Client cache, if it's enabled at the client level, you'll be able to see how much cache is being used to store bitmaps and other things at the client device. Session information will again give you a lot of information about the particular session, the client build number that they're using to connect from, etc., etc., the client directory. So a lot of useful information that could help you in troubleshooting any particular issue that can come up. Client modules, these are all the client modules that are being used from a Citrix perspective. If need be, you could take a look at any particular one with their particular DLLs that are running. Processes is what I find very, very useful. In a lot of instances, you might need to kill a particular process. The user is trying to connect, and let's say they're trying to map a drive, but they don't have access to that drive, and the login script is giving them an issue. You can try to fix the logon script and then have them log out, log back in, or you can come in here and kill the net command or the CMD command, have them log into the session, continue working, and you can fix your own thing later. So you're able to interact with the particular processes that make up the session and kill whichever one you find necessary. You can select it, right click, and select terminate, and that will kill that particular process. Now I'll come back to this in a second. Now the other thing you can take a look at here are the current if you double click on the particular session, you'll see that all of those tabs that I was telling you about have now been enumerated for you in an easier view to take a look at. Now you can also, if there are any columns here that you want to take a look at that are not available, you can choose columns and select any which one that's not available. So if you want the priority, for example, voila, it shows up in here. So it gives you a little more granularity as far as what you're trying to find or look at. Now this is one way by which you can find your users. Another way by which you can find the user is by clicking on servers. And let's start by just selecting the servers node in general, the master node here that has everything encapsulated under it, right? So if you select servers, one of the views that I like to take a look at, one of the columns or the information that I'm mostly interested in, is sometimes I want to look at, well, what's going on in my servers? How many sessions do I have on every particular server? So right now, if you click on contents, it'll tell you that you have 2 servers, gives you all this information, but it doesn't necessarily tell you which sessions or how many sessions, what's the session count in the farm. I want to be able to know how much load is on my farm. So one of the columns that I like to enable is if you click on choose column here and you find session count, it will tell you how many users. And this is just think that it may take a long time for it to retrieve all the user data. Do you still want to do that? Yes. So the session count will tell you how many users are connected per server. So I find that helpful or easier for me to be able to determine, do I have enough servers? Do I need more servers? And if you have like 10 or 20 or 30 or 100 XenApp servers, they'll all be listed here. And each one of the servers, you'll see that there's a session count, so you know how many sessions are running on this particular server. So again, here, once you go in, if you want to be able to find the user based on just selecting the servers node here and then going to users, it'll also list all of the users across all of the servers. That's one way of doing it. The other way is to go drill down on every server itself and figure out, well, which users are connected to which servers. So you can do that by selecting the users tab here, which is going to list all the users. Again, if you double click on it, it'll show you the same view as before. Now the other thing that I want to talk about here real quick is if you go back to XA01, while the users tab is very helpful, the sessions tab is even more helpful, because the sessions tab for this particular server will tell you how many ICA listener ports you have. So typically the listener ports, and we discussed this in earlier lessons, the whole purpose of a listener port is to wait for an incoming session. When it receives an incoming session, it makes a connection. The listener port makes a connection between the session and the server and goes back into a listening state. So if this particular server isn't accepting connections or users are complaining that they can't connect, you might want to come in and take a look at the ICA-TCP, which is the listener port, and make sure that it's listening, where otherwise it could be down or disconnected. Whatever the state might be, it should be listening, otherwise it will not accept connections from an incoming session. Now you'll also see that I have a session that's already connected, so it changes its state from listening to active once that session is connected and goes back into listening state here. Now if you wanted to reset it or do anything like that, you can right click it, click on reset. You have other tasks here where you can refresh the data as well, but resetting it might help sometimes into bringing this ICA listener port back into a listening state, which would allow it to accept incoming connections. Now the same thing here, if you wanted to right click it, you have all the same features on the session tab to interact with that session, kill it, whatever you want it to do. Now speaking of the ICA listener port, let me show you what you can use, or what the tool that we talked about in the presentation that you can use to configure the ICA listener port. Now you'll notice that you have an ICA listener port and you have the RDP listener port. The RDP is just the traditional RDP listener port that you get when you install remote desktop services on this particular server, and it functions exactly the same way here. Sessions, IDs, etc., etc. Now, if you want to configure your ICA listener port, we're going to click on Start, All Programs. We're going to go into Citrix. We're going to come down here to Administration Tools, and we're going to select ICA Listener Configuration. Once you select the ICA Listener Configuration, if you reset the listener port earlier and it didn't work, for whatever reason that wasn't working, you might want to come in here and maybe delete it and recreate it. You might want to come in here and take a look at, well, what could be causing the problem here, right? You could disable it and re-enable it. Maybe that will reset it into a listening state. You could take a look at the security, which users are currently configured or are allowed to connect via ICA. Right now we have the remote desktop users. Anybody in remote desktop user is able to connect. You might not necessarily want to keep this default user group. From a security perspective, you could take it out, and maybe you have a Citrix users group that you add back in here, and then you give it the necessary rights. Actually, that's one of the things that I do in my implementations, is I remove this default group and put a specific Citrix users group. That way, this current group right now gives you access to both RDP and ICA. And I don't necessarily want my users to even be able to try to connect to RDP, so I completely remove that. I find that as a security enhancement. So you can add another user, give them the proper access. Once you've made sure all of that is correct, you can click on Edit if you wanted to change it. Now keep in mind, some of these settings that I'm going to show you here can be overridden via the Citrix policies. What we're doing here is you're configuring them at the server level, so keep that in mind. We talked about end disconnected sessions. Right now it's set to never. Obviously Citrix policies can override that, but you can also specify a time frame or an interval by which you want the session, if it's in disconnected stage, to end. It'll just let it go. Active sessions, how long are you allowing active sessions? Typically this is left to, you never want to end them. They never have a limit, but if there's for any security reason, you can do that as well. Keep in mind we discussed this in Citrix policies, and you can override it. Now the thing that you want to pay attention to here is network adapters. Right now, if you have more than one network adapter in your XenApp server, the ICA listener is configured to listen on all of the NICs in the server. You can limit that. So if you have more than one, you can drop it down and say, I want you to listen in only on the Intel Pro 1000 one, not necessarily on all the other ones. So if a connection is coming in from another network interface card, it will not accept it. This again might be a reason why, you know, some people are unable to connect, or there's issues here. For the most part, you're going to be setting this to all network adapters. And down here, from an ICA connection perspective, how many connections are you going to allow onto the server? Typically it's unlimited, but if you wanted to cap it where, okay, I just want to allow 20 connections to the server and that's it, no more, then you can select the maximum connections that are physically allowed to this particular server. From an environment perspective, again, there are certain things that you can do, like run an application as soon as a connection is configured. As soon as a session is established, I want you to run a connection. I don't want to allow it to initialize any kind of programs when you're to launch, etc., etc. So you're able to configure a lot of the environment as to what happens when that session is established here. Again, for the most part, most of these are configured via Citrix policy, so you would never touch them. The idea behind this tool isn't to necessarily configure the environment or the sessions. It's more to configure which network adapters are configured for the ICA protocol, and also if you needed to add a new protocol or delete this one in particular, add another one, whatever the case might be, this is the configuration utility that you would use it. Now earlier on we talked about shadowing. So, you know, right here you can right click on this particular user, drag down to shadow. As an administrator, it's beautiful, right? Life is great. You can shadow the users, great. Now, what happens if you want to be able to allow other users to shadow one another if they want to assist them? Now, you might have an organization where there might be power users involved. Our help desk is very effective in troubleshooting, Citrix specific issues, desktop specific issues, even applications issues, but applications that are like standard Office, WinZip, Adobe, stuff like that. But if you have an application in the environment, like for example an ERP application, JD Edwards, Oracle, PeopleSoft, Dynamics, whatever the case might be, where your help desk doesn't necessarily or doesn't have the knowledge of troubleshooting the application specific issues because they don't know the application. They can troubleshoot everything around the application, but they don't necessarily troubleshoot the application itself. So in this case, what you do is, if the environment is large enough, you nominate users that are known as your power users. So if users in the community are having issues with your ERP system specifically, they can't run crystal reports, or they want to be able to modify something or find a particular tab, or they don't know how to do a journal entry, etc. Instead of calling the regular help desk, they call one of the designated power users. Now, one of the tools that you can give your power users is known as the Shadow Taskbar, and it's available here under All Programs, Citrix, Shadow Taskbar, under Administration, Shadow Taskbar. Typically what you would want to do is publish this application to the power users. Once the power users have this application and they're able to launch it, one of their colleagues calls up and says, I need help, they launch the Shadow Taskbar, and you obviously have to give them some training, but if they click on Shadow here, they're able to enumerate the different users within the farm that they can or cannot shadow. So for example, if they want to enumerate users based on servers, they can do this by selecting servers, selecting XA01 here, and you'll see that we have the administrator that's currently connected. If they click on Add, they're adding the particular user that they want to shadow. Click on OK, and that session will launch, and they're able to shadow their friend or colleague and give assistance. When they're done, they log out, and the user goes about their own way. So this is a very useful tool to use here in order to grant users and power users the ability to shadow one another in order for them to be able to assist and take load off of the particular help desk if need be. Especially for application specific reasons, I find that very, very useful tool. So I wanted to make sure you knew where that was, and that's an additional administrative tool that you have that I personally recommend that you should actually publish as a published application. Now the last tool that I want to talk about is also under Programs, Citrix, Administrative Tools, and it's called the Speed Screen Latency Reduction Manager. Now, Speed Screen Latency Reduction Manager is per server. So again, this is one of those tools that's there. It's really cool and helpful, but we used to use this tool, at least the last time I used it, was when there was modems. When the application is on a really unreliable connection and it's not responding properly, and you wanted a way to make the application respond better. If you have links that have 500 millisecond latencies or 150 millisecond latencies, and you wanted to make the user experience just a little bit better, the Speed Screen Latency Reduction Manager helps in that. And I want to go through it real quick here to show you the capabilities. I don't necessarily think you'll use this, but I wanted to make sure you knew that it existed and what its capabilities are. So to start with, like I said, this is very server specific. So if you have a lot of servers, it could be very difficult to configure just because you have to be repetitive, and I would rather use the Citrix policies and all the enhancements that you get with the policies to maybe try to avoid doing that. But if they're an application that, or if there's some users that are connecting to a particular application and their connection is very lousy, we want to be able to address what happens when the user's typing on the keyboard and nothing is showing up on the screen right away. It's taking 2-3 seconds after they type for anything to show up on the screen. Or if the user is double-clicking an application or double-clicking a task and that double-click command isn't taking effect right away, what happens is the user will continue to double-click and eventually fill up the buffer, and at some point when all these commands reach the server and execute, they'll go after one another, and then that'll generate a bunch of errors and screens, and the user will start complaining. So what we want to try to do with Speed Screen Latency Reduction Manager is acknowledge that the user is typing something. And we can do that in any number of different ways. We can do that by reducing the color of the font or the size of the font. When the user is double clicking, we want to at least tell the user that something is happening. So this is the whole idea behind Speed Screen Latency Reduction Manager. So to start, what we're going to do is click on Application, and I want to drag down here to where it says Server Properties. Under Server Properties, the first thing you want to do is, do you want to enable local text echo as default on all applications on the server? So what happens when you enable local text echo, if there's not enough bandwidth, if you're typing and nothing is showing up on the screen, by enabling local text echo, what happens is the server is going to make a determination. It's either going to reduce the size of the font so that it can process it quicker, and as such it will display the text for you in the session right away. It might change the text family font that you're using. So if you're not using Arial or you're using Times New Roman, any one of those fonts, it might revert back to a very standard font type and just use that until it has a chance to process, and then it'll change it to the one that you originally wanted. All this is doing is just showing you that there's response here. It might not be the right font type, but hey, you're able to type, so your user experience is fine. And what happens is, as soon as the session starts to catch up to what you're typing, it starts to change the font, etc., etc. Now, if the connection is very bad and reducing the font size or even changing the font family type isn't enough, what the server will do is it will show you bubbles. You're typing, but instead of having letters, you're seeing these bubbles show up. All the server is telling you in this case is, hey, I acknowledge that keystroke. I understand that you've typed. I understand. So as far as you're concerned, the session is not freezing on you, or it's not lagging. It's moving, right? Now, as the session catches up, it will replace the bubbles with the right letters. This could be annoying, but at least the session is responsive in that you're not having to wait 2 or 3 seconds to see text or anything like that. So that's what happens when you enable local text echo here. Enable mouse click feedback. Again, if the connection is slow and you're double clicking, nothing's happening. So if, for example, I double click here, it's instantaneous, right? But if in your session you click and it doesn't immediately take effect, you're going to click it again and again and again. What happens when you do enable mouse click feedback is it will acknowledge that you clicked the mouse. It won't necessarily put the check mark back into the checkbox, but it will acknowledge it. So it won't let you keep clicking it again, because it'll tell you, okay, I got it. So you'll know, you get some kind of a response from the server, so you don't have to click it again. So I find this very, very useful. Now, the latency thresholds here. At what point do you want speed screen latency to kick in? Do you want it to kick in when the latency is very high, and you determine very high by 500 millisecond, for example, here? If it detects latency of 500 millisecond or more, speed screen latency kicks in, and those two technologies kick in. Low latency threshold. What is considered low latency threshold? Anything 50 millisecond or less, I want to consider a low latency threshold. So once you've configured these particular settings, you click on OK. Now it's time to configure the application that you want to take advantage of this thing. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to right click down here, you're going to click on Add New Application. Now we're going to go through with this using Notepad just to keep things simple. First thing you want to do is you want to find that particular application. In my case, I'm going to see if I can locate Notepad here. We're going to click on Next, and we are enabling local text echo for this application. Once you do that, the next screen here in the wizard will allow you to apply settings to all installations of this selected application. So if you have multiple instances of this application installed, it's applying them to all of them, or you can apply them to just this particular instance of the application. Click on Finish, and it just added this application. Now once it's added, you can right click on it, you can delete it if you needed to, or you can go into the application properties. Now this gets very, very interesting, and the feature set here is very deep, and this just gives you an idea of how flexible XenApp is, how flexible the ICA protocol is, and how thin this protocol really is, because I'm going to show you some really cool things that you might never use, but nonetheless, it's still good to see, right? So the first thing you want to do here, you can disable local text echo for this application if you wanted to. You can limit local text echo for this application to the following. So the limit type could be display text in place. So you want to see the text. You don't want bubbles. You don't want anything else. You want text to be displayed in place. Or if you select display text in floating bubble, this is what I was telling you about. If you're typing and it can't put a font there, it will put a floating bubble just to tell you that I've acknowledged the keystroke you just typed. I haven't received what it is yet, but you can keep typing. I will refresh that screen as soon as I get more information. That's what happens when you display text in floating bubble here. If you force speech screen to treat input fields in this application in native mode, some applications will just not accept that speech screen try to wrap that thing around it where you can, once you're typing, it's floating the bubbles. So the floating bubble thing comes into effect because what speech screen is going to do is going to detect all the input fields in the application. So let's say you have name, address, whatever it is, salutation, whatever it is. It's going to detect these fields that accept text, and it's going to wrap this speech screen wrapper around them so that it can display these floating bubbles. Some applications just don't like that, and they just want to be treated in native mode, so you can select that particular checkbox here if you want to treat those input fields as native mode. Now, once you've made the selection here, well, now it's time to configure the input fields for this application so that we can use speech screen latency against them. Now, speech screen can't automatically find all the necessary input fields in an application. So what it'll allow you to do is it would allow you to configure the input fields for the application. So we've selected Notepad, we've configured all the settings for Notepad. You're still in the application settings of Notepad. Now you're going to click on New. New will start this other wizard that allows you to detect the input fields in an application. So you get to this screen here, and at this point what you have to do is launch Notepad as an application. Now keep in mind, Notepad only has one input field, so it's kind of easy for us to use it. But some applications will have a lot of input fields like first name, last name, address, social security number, telephone number. You would have to do this process to every one of those input fields. What we're doing here is we're going to select this icon and we're going to drag it to Notepad, and it will automatically detect the field class or the field type. So if I do this, bada bing, it's found that the field class for this is edit. So now we are doing the speech screen latency against this particular field or this field class. Anytime it finds a class of field within the application of edit, it's going to apply the settings that we've told it to apply earlier on. Now, once it's ready, we're going to click on next here. You can select the threshold by which you want to apply speech screen latency reduction. What's the level that you're trying to apply it to? If you select medium here, you'll notice that it says text is displayed in place with acceleration. Its limited acceleration is available, etc., etc. And you can take the slider up, low, high, off, whatever you want to do with it. So if you select it down here to low, it's telling you basically no in-place acceleration of text input. So depending on what you're trying to do, obviously if you're trying to use speech screen latency, you want to set it to the highest it can go. And then you're going to click on next, and we're going to click on finish. Now once you have that, yeah, there's a lot to configure here. Again, it just goes to show you how flexible this is. So once you have this input field here, well, now you can tweak the local text echo even more. So limit, now we have it set to display text in place. I can switch that to, well, I want it to be able to do floating bubbles because they're still complaining. You can do the reduce font size, so you can reduce the font size by 10% and see if that helps. You can use system default color, so you're not using the color that you're specifying. That maybe it's just black, and then as soon as it catches up, it'll change that to red. Input field is a password, so if it's trying to reduce the color of the font or the size of the font, etc., if it's a password field, you need to tell the system that it's a password field so it hides the characters. So again, this is a security thing that you need to know here. Hidden characters denoted by either stars or however way you want to denote it by. So once you have all of this configured, click on OK, and bada bing bada boom. You have Notepad now configured and ready for use with Speech Screen Latency Reduction Manager. You turn it on the client side, and bada bing bada boom. I showed you how you do that at the client level lesson when we discussed that. Now this application is ready to be used with Speech Screen Latency Reduction Manager. As soon as it detects latency of 500 millisecond or above, this will kick in. Now this is limited to this particular server, so if you wanted to enable this on other servers, you would have to go through this exercise on every one of those servers. So I just wanted to bring you up to speed with regards to the Speed Screen Latency Reduction Manager tool so that you know that it's there and how to use it. Alright, we're going to switch back to our presentation and recap what we've learned. In this lesson, we started off by talking about managing user sessions, right? So we started by taking a look at, well, where can you go to take a look at which users are connected? I showed you how you can find that by application, by a server. We looked at the different processes that the user session is using and how you can terminate some of these processes if you need to for troubleshooting purposes or whatnot. We then took a look at the shadow taskbar. The shadow taskbar, again, is an application that you can publish, especially for those power users, in order for them to shadow their colleagues and maybe help them with an issue that they're having because it's an application issue that your help desk might not be able to deal with. We took a look at the ICA listener configuration and the fact that, every remote protocol, at least the RDP and ICA for that matter, have listener sessions. These listener sessions will wait for an incoming session to come, make a connection with the server, and then go back into a listening state. So how do you configure that ICA listener? We went through that whole configuration, showed you how you can disable it, set security on it, even create a new one, or maybe narrow it down to be listening on a specific NIC within the XenApp server rather than listening on all of the network interface adapters within the server. And then we finally talked about Speed Screen Latency Reduction Manager and how you can configure certain applications that maybe users from India or China or somewhere on the other side of the world are trying to connect, and maybe the servers, because they're in the US, there's 500 millisecond or more latency between those links. Well, what can you do to make that user experience better? We talked about the local text echo and the mouse clicks and how you can configure those so that the user at least knows that the session understands that I'm typing or I'm double clicking certain things. Finally, I hope this lesson was informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.